All right, so if you need to leave home and you want to continue listening to the conversation, you can do so on Talk City 91.1 FM. We are live on radio as well as on TV talking about the budget this morning. So welcome back inside the Now Morning Show. We're here with Mariano Brown and Dr. Marlene Atz, as well as on Zoom we have Dr. Lester Henry and Natalie Legault is here as well.
Yes, of course, naturally. And, you know, we keep talking about, you know, the systems that are missing. And it just brings me to, you know, what should we look at for transfers and subsidies? Because if we don't have those systems in place that tells us, as you say, if it's not data-driven to say how many people are on the breadline, how many people are in need of services, then how do we get to the point of saying, okay, this is how we can make steps to improve? You know, because those transfers and subsidies over the years have been in the billions of dollars.
Well, I think we have to stop talking about it as one number. The transfers and subsidies includes both transfers to state enterprises as well as what we would consider to be subsidies or grants. One of the most significant components of which would be what we consider to be the senior citizens grant, right, which has been rising. And in fact, there's an inequitable situation with regard to how we measure it and how we pay it relative to what NIB, the NIB, which is a contributory scheme.
Let me just play devil's advocate. Should we be paying people senior citizens pension who never worked for it, who never contributed in that way to the system?
Well, it's a provision which arose from a time when we didn't have pension systems. So in a sense, it's been there for a little while. In fact, it comes out of what used to be called the Widows and Orphans Fund. It was really, it's part of the Commonwealth Empire, in the sense of all those who contributed to the war effort, so that there was a minimum available grant which was paid to those people who made a contribution in that way. And we extended it on the basis of independence, and we've also defined it in a way which takes off what would have been a social safety net, which was required to support those who did not fall into the NIB net. But the NIB net is, we're 50 years into that. And one of the provisions in the NIB positioning was to bring people in who were self-employed. And we've never done it because there's also a gap. If you're bringing people into the net who are self-employed, it's made up of both the individual's contribution as well as the employer's contribution. To make it whole and to holistic for them to fall in, somebody has to cover that gap. Right? And that's a state. And as we've taken, the longer we have taken, our economic circumstances has changed. The size of that gap coverage has increased. And that's the difficulty. The longer you take to make a decision, the harder it gets. Right? The things build up. Right? I mean, when I was in office in 2010 and pensions fell under me, our gap in terms of a pension contributory scheme for public servants at the time would have been about 30 billion. Right? Now, taking actuarial assumptions into position, and with the 13 years that have gone since then, 11 or 12 years, the actuarial calculation for that is that has risen from about 30 billion to about 100 billion. Wow. Right? So the gap keeps getting bigger the longer you take to do it. Now, the social, and that issue there about the number of people who fall within that social safety net and the definition is we have that difficulty, for example, when people have complained, notwithstanding the fact that we put into position, and this goes to Dr. Henry's point about putting incentives in position. Well, we talked about a salary grant, and the number of people who complained that they applied and never got it, never heard from them. Well, that's part of the problem with the incentives position, because the legislation or the intent is there, but the actual regulations to make it happen, to allow for the incentives to be collected and so on, in the services sector in particular. Certainly with regard to those companies that are making transfers to or making benefit payments and or investing in companies that are in the services sector, in particular entertainment. To try to collect on that from the inland revenue, I mean, that's an impossibility. It's the same thing.
Wow. Right?
So it's one thing to talk about putting incentives in position, how much talk, but at the end of it, these things have to be supported. It's like the hotel incentive. Right? I mean, I could tell you of a hotelier who established a hotel in the 1990s on that, and I've never been able to get the grant. So it's not enough to say we legislated the incentives. It is what takes place afterwards to make these things work.
Will the Revenue Authority change anything? Will that kind of bring things on stream? Why are you laughing? Why are you laughing?
Whoa, I was being schooled on the Revenue Authority a couple of weeks ago. I don't purport to know everything about the Revenue Authority, but I am not as confident as I was before that the Revenue Authority is going to be the panacea, that it is going to allow for the collection and the kind of efficiency that is being articulated. So we all know of the challenges with the Board of Inland Revenue, but my understanding of how the Revenue Authority is going to be implemented and manned, so to speak, in terms of its structure and its operational structure, makes me wonder whether or not it is actually the correct approach for us to deal with it. So what we're doing is that we've decided that the Board of Inland Revenue is not satisfying, and it is inefficient, and it is whatever else that led to the justification for this Revenue Authority.
Well, I think what they said as well is that the Public Service Commission controls the appointments, the hirings, and all the BIR,
whereas the Revenue Authority,
and that was a problematic issue.
And the Revenue Authority, as I understand it, is going to be controlled by the Minister of Finance.
Right, and that the board will be appointed
by the Minister of Finance.
Right, I think, but I think enforcement still falls under the Public Service Commission.
But the question is, do we want to have a Revenue Authority that essentially is an extension of the Ministry of Finance? That is the question.
And that's the question.
And how much authority will they have, and will they be able to efficiently discharge their duties? And essentially, because the justification for the Revenue Authority, again, as I understand it, is that we recognize the Board of Inland Revenue is not as efficient as we would like it to be. It is a pain point, etc., etc. But my question is, now that I understand a bit more about the Revenue Authority from somebody who is on the inside, in the belly of the whale, so to speak, is whether or not, in its current construct, whether that is going to allow us to realize the kind of benefit that we think it is going to have.
I know Mariano is definitely
going to say no. I know he's chomping at the bit. I saw him.
Let us bring Dr. Henry, your thoughts on this. Do you think the Revenue Authority will give us that kind of structure that we need to get the government to collect those taxes that are so needed to help the country?
But also make payments. There are lots of outstanding payments.
Yeah.
Of course. And now, of course, there is no magic bullet that will make any institution or any entity automatically successful. It has to be supported, it has to be implemented properly. Now, what on this issue of taxes, what my understanding of what the Revenue Authority is supposed to be helping with is to broaden the tax base, right? As many of us know, there's a lot of people in this country that pay no taxes or do not pay their fair share, just like in other countries.
Why couldn't we have broadened it under the BIR?
Huh?
Why couldn't we have broadened that tax net under the BIR?
Well, based on some of what my colleague Dr. Atz just said, because of the inefficiencies and so on. This is supposed to be ironed out to some extent with the Revenue Authority, right? That's one of the reasons why we're moving in that direction, right? Now, if you get a broadening of the tax base, right? Because based, for example, you mentioned before the Gaming Act, like the casinos and so on that pay basically
the Gambling Control Bill.
Right. That if that is implemented, for example, right, and you get a fair share of taxes from those entities, right, that doesn't affect the average poor person, right? This money is leakages from it represents a significant leakage from the system. That doesn't affect the welfare of ordinary citizens. This is something, a revenue source that the government could tap into that is relatively, that is full up. Well, first to be long overdue. I mean, we are the only country that I have known of, and I don't think there's any with an unregularized, untaxed gaming sector in the world, probably.
But Dr. Henry,
I don't think there's anyone else.
Dr. Henry, while I agree that a Revenue Authority could make a difference in terms of broadening the tax base, the reality is that Trinidad and Tobago has a cultural problem of just organizing and getting structures in place. So I'm wondering if with the issues that we have, if even saying, okay, here's a revenue authority, remember a lot of those people who work at BIR will be transferred to the revenue authority so that they don't lose their benefits, they don't lose their time. How will that make a difference, especially that enforcement is still with the Public Service Commission?
Right. Well, of course, the argument is that we are switching to these things because there's a more centralized system where you would bring and link customs with BIR and everything, bring everything under one sort of organizational structure. Now, of course, as we know in this country, everyone becomes a law unto themselves when they are in charge of the BIR, customs, whatever, and there's no serious coordination. I'm sure many of us who have tried to do transactions with any of these entities understand this, right? Each one of them. I mean, I have been on parliamentary committees where we have had people from the BIR come into the committee and in full view of cameras and civil basically, we are the only ones who can do this and we don't really care what you do. And tell a parliamentary committee straight to their face, that we are the ones in charge. And, we have certain laws that we have to abide by and so on. And we're not going to bother with anything you tell us.
Yeah, but this, I mean, whether we change the name and we say revenue authority, the reality is that if oversight is by the Minister of Finance, it's literally like a state enterprise. And we see the issues we have with state enterprises.
All right, let me comment on this because, again, this problem comes up every time there's any entity that is debated, such as revenue authority, such as procurement, the procurement legislation and so on. And it is basically impossible. What you're doing, if you say you don't want the government or the minister to be involved, you're basically asking the government not to govern. Because there's no way you could design a system, right, where you could exclude the Minister of Finance and the government from a serious entity like the Revenue Authority. That just is unworkable.
Dr. Abs.
We have tried it. We have discussed this in committee stages of bills.
Let us allow these two to weigh in on it. I'm sure they have some thoughts on what you just said.
I mean, my only take on it, I think we need to understand, put this in context. We have to navigate a COVID-adjusted economic reality, which means we have to get back to some kind of normal. COVID-adjusted normal is the term that I would want to use. We know that one of our pain points and our bugbears in terms of getting back to normal is the ease of doing business, whether it's for nationals, for foreign investors, whatever the case might be. We need to get it right. We cannot have a new institution. We can't pour old wine into new bottles and tell you, well, it's new wine and all of these things. We have to get it right. Otherwise, we're going to be stymied. We're going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. So whether you call it Revenue Authority or BIR or it's thing or whatever, we need to understand and embrace our truth that this has been a pain point for us in this country for many years. And calling it a revenue authority, and I'm not getting into the semantics of the revenue authority as opposed to BIR, but it is one of our pain points for doing business. So we talk about entrepreneurs, we talk about this, those persons would need to engage with these entities, whether it's called BIR or revenue authority, and it is going to stymie any opportunities for us to have export-led growth in Trinidad and Tobago and for us to get back to doing the business of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And that's the point that I would really like to make, that we need to understand the implications when we have these institutions that are not functioning and how it impacts on everything else. So really, it is the onus is on us, government, whomever it is, but for the people of Trinidad and Tobago to understand that we can't get back to any kind of COVID-adjusted reality. Let's try to exclude the government from it. But we can't have a reality unless we fix some of these things.
Marina, let's talk about what Dr. Henry just said, is that if the government, if we're saying the Minister of Finance shouldn't be in charge, it's literally like asking the government not to govern.
No, part of the difficulty of that is we've been losing trust and in the ability of government and or ministers to govern without interference and or interference that is not self-interested. I think that's a critical point, and that, for example, is what you see in the response to the Police Service Commission and the appointment of a commissioner. Yeah. That is the essence of the argument. All right, that what are the parameters? Now, since I was there around the time that Revenue Authority came up, and by the way, Revenue Authority is a logical outgrowth of the reforms which were started by the NAR and the Revenue Authority. Actually, the idea of the Revenue Authority goes back to 1990s.
And we still don't
have it. That's a fundamental issue. And the difficulty is what we will consider to be organizational transformation. Now, we think of the energy sector as being efficient. We think of government as getting revenue from it. But government has been handling the energy sector particularly badly, and very much in the same way in which we have managed how we have organized the Board of Inland Revenue. I am of the opinion, and I have said so very publicly, that if we keep waiting for the Revenue Authority, we keep waiting just like we were waiting for to reorganize WASA, right? Or to put in property tax. Property tax is 1965, right? That's when we started to make those changes. We postponed it because of 1970, right? Here we are. A real effort was made. All different. So we actually tested out the new system in Point Forte in San Fernando, right? For 4 years. So it's not to say that we didn't have property tax imposition. There was a system which actually levied taxes on the basis of the system that was proposed and that is proposed moving forward. That was in position in Point Forte and San Fernando. We didn't have any big hullabaloo about how it was operated. It worked, right? So it's not that it can't work. The issue is organizational transformation, setting an objective and doing it. That's one of the key issues that we have to do. And putting rules in position that we will follow.
And one of the key difficulties we have with organizational transformation is what? Right. People.
People. Yeah. Well, and I'm going to use an example. The best example of what we will call an empty transformation would be HDC. All right? We moved from NHA. There are very valid and strong reasons to move from NHA towards HDC, to put in a structure to be able to do that. But we didn't identify all of the organization problems before. We didn't put them in a box and say, this is how we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it by this particular time. We switch over, we drop the whole thing into a new institution. Well, you give it a new name. You put it in a new building. Right? Same, right, exactly that point.
From the debate in the upper house, one of the issues that they've identified with the Board of Inland Revenue is that, and even Custom and Excise, is that two, they're separated, that's one, and two, is that the Public Service Commission, there are so many spaces, jobs to be filled that have not filled, and therefore it creates a lot of inefficiency in BIR. And the thing is that...
Not just BIR, but a lot of public sector...
But the point is that you have to bring your management into the 21st century. And we have to stop seeing them as things that, well, we have to be, people make decisions, people implement things, people manage things. There have to be results and there have to be consequences for having no results. That's what we have to move to. Consider, we moved away from the Ministry of Health to the regional authorities. Why did we break it up? Because we wanted to make each one of them more responsive. But it means that we had to put in a management system to restructure it. People had to make a choice at some stage, 5 years, 2 years, 3 years, as to whether they were working with the IHAs or the Ministry of Health. We never did it, right? So 20 years later, people are retiring, some in the Ministry of Health, some in the IHAs. Eventually, over time, it will solve itself, right? In the sense that those who were in the middle before will move out. And then everybody is now, who has entered through the IHAs will now become part. But it took too long. The issue is setting those things. There's no easy way to make an omelette if you're not going to break the egg, right? And the people are going to be disaffected. People don't like change. People sometimes they don't see the opportunities to think about what's going to affect them. We have to be able to address it.
One of the things that I've noticed, there are people who make decisions thinking they're making decisions on behalf of the government or trying to shield the government, which just really backfires and smashes in the government's face like an egg. And I see it all the time where political decisions are made. And those political decisions just ruin everything. And you ask yourself, but I wonder if the government knows about this. And sometimes you realize that no. You know, that the people are making decisions on behalf of the government that is not helping the government.
You know, I want to ask Mr. Brown, you mentioned just now in terms of changing the management structure and the management style that we have been using in the public sector for however long, right? Does that not require some constitutional reform?
Yes and no. Many of the changes, for example, we didn't have HR officers or HR directors in ministries before. They didn't make any changes for that to happen. Right? Those were administrative changes. And we tend to get hung up. SORT, for example, was done under administrative change. but everybody said, well, it's the law, it was the law, it was the law. It didn't have to do with the law. You can make those sort of administrative changes. We can, right? The point is that you have to put the management systems in position to be able to, to support them.
So I think that's the biggest issue.
And you have to have a clear sense of what are your objectives and how you're working towards those objectives. But sometimes these decisions reek of management by VAP. So you just decide that this sounds good and let's move to this, as opposed to articulating all of the steps that are required to get a particular outcome.
So, and the point I want to make, and that's just a follow on from that. That's why when we started public sector reform, it wasn't just a buzzword. There was a serious issue of putting HR in at the center of the management of the ministries. So it's the same thing with regard to the RHAs, right? But it also has to be complemented with management systems that are in position. Now, we didn't put those things in position. We made some changes, we broke up the institutions, but we didn't put in necessary management information systems in position to be able to allow for the variations. Now, a lot of that takes time. But the point is, if you don't do it, if you don't set it out, what you end up with is a whole series of things that just don't work and they look like they're not connected, right? The public sector reform was meant to be part of all of that in the 1990s. We thought that you make some initiatives, you put it in position, and we forgot about it. The answer is those things are continuous. People change, systems have to be developed, it's continuous.
So that regardless of who is there and regardless of who is that the system still works.
And it also requires a cultural shift within.
Tell me one institution that we have where that is working.
But it's standalone. It's a standalone institution. And the standalone institution will be the central bank because it's not part of anything. Right? It's operating on its own. Yeah. So waiting on for the central bank, for example, we wouldn't have any kind of economic statistics at all. Right? So that the point I'm going back to make is that one of the things that Trinidad and Tobago has to face up to is that the world is moving on. We cannot continue with systems that were built for the 19th and 20th century. So public sector reform is not an idea and you do it and you finish it. It's a continuous development cycle.
But it
works from government to government.
It means you need that blueprint that's there where people can say, okay, we reach here, this is where we need to go next, and we keep adding and
but first thing we need to do is to lay down the blueprint and to say this is the plan.
But you also need monitoring and evaluation so that you know whether you are making improvements, whether you're regressing, whether you're progressing, and that you tweak the system as you move along. Because since it is new and you're going into a sector, let's say the public sector, for example, that is well entrenched and this is how we do things and there is a book and the person who deals with this and the clerk who deals. It requires constant tweaking because you're also going to be dealing with cultural shifts and trying to infuse a new culture so that you can advance it to where you want it to be.
You're also dealing with stubborn, hardened people.
You're also dealing with human beings. You're also dealing with human beings.
Some of them stubborn and hardened, we can't deny that. Like at the end of the day, we have to realize that like a big part of the challenges that we face is that some people just don't want to change.
And that's one of the difficulties when we focus on the budget speech and we focus on the fiscal incentive and we focus on 1, 2.
So this is what I was going to ask. Based on all these issues that we're bringing up here, right? How does the Minister of Finance present anything that can fix these problems? Like, we can't.
He can't fix those problems with presentations, right? He can't fix those problems with a tax law, right? Or any change along those lines. At the end of the day, it's an accounting exercise, but it has some economic consequences. What has to do is with the organizational discipline. Now, that is not something that you associate with running a government. But when we talk about ease of doing business, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about organizational discipline. That it will work, that it will work continuously, and it will work across a broad spectrum. Now, that is about management. Right? Now, that is part of we assume that a government comes into position and that exists. It is a wrong assumption in Trinidad and Tobago. That is precisely what we have to fix.
All right. Harko Beacon, when he was here in the last hour, said that we have economists, we have financial analysts, we have a lot of people who have given of themselves freely and have given good advice. He talked about the Economic Advisory Board, the Roadmap to Recovery Committee, and he's saying that the thing is that this Minister of Finance has just ignored all the good things that have been presented to him. Do you all share that view?
I don't know about you all. Minister Imbert is a difficult man to deal with. He's a difficult man to deal with. Right? That's a fact. right? But the point is, right, he has a boss.
Yeah.
He has a boss.
Should have one, yes.
He has a boss.
Should have one.
He has a boss.
Should have one,
right?
Yeah.
Now, if they're having trouble with Mr. Imbit and Mr. Imbit is not following, then there's something wrong with the boss, right? Because the boss job, the job of a boss is to keep things on track, to keep it moving in a particular.
Mr. Imbit is doing.
Well, that's another matter.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Dr. Ash, because we have to
I think my last statement is that I agree with the point that we focus too much on the numbers, and we need to understand that the budget really is about the people, which is why I think I would love for us at some point in time as we navigate towards adulthood as a country that we start having different conversations. So a budget presentation where everybody is glued to the TV to see if gas going up and cigarette going up. And those are not the conversations. The conversations about how do we improve, and particularly now, as I keep saying, we have an opportunity for a COVID-adjusted reality. What is going to come out of that statement at 1:30 that is going to help us understand the challenges ahead of us and how we're going to navigate as a people moving forward. So it's not just about the numbers and who get 5 billion and who gets 7. It is about what we do with it.
Because if we keep giving them, they'll think everything is normal and everything is okay, and it isn't.
Dr. Henry, closing words?
Yeah, I'm happy you remembered me. I thought I was invisible for a while there. Yes. Now, I expect that the minister will continue along the path where the government has stressed social stability. And if we look at what has happened over the past 5 years, 6, they have not really touched the social safety net, which is important to the peace and stability of the country. Right? Many people old enough to remember, as I alluded to before, said that a lot of the crime and the instability that came out of the 1990s was rooted in the structural adjustment program of the NAR in the late 1980s. We want to avoid that kind of scenario. We know that Trinidad and Tobago can be a very volatile place, and people are very resistant to change. Even change that could be beneficial to many citizens is not usually warmly welcome. So as Mariano stated at the beginning of the program, that the minister is in a very difficult situation, and we must understand that not only Trinidad and Tobago, but the world is in a difficult situation.
Indeed. Dr. Henry, thank you so much. We have to wrap it up there. But I want to encourage you, Trinidad and Tobago, to stay tuned to TTT all day long as we give you a pre-budget talks coming up at 12 noon with Crystal Wilson, and then coming up later on tonight at 7 p.m., DK Rostand is going to have the post-budget discussion and a whole host of panelists. So you guys stay tuned. I want to thank you so much, everybody who was on the panel this morning. Thank you for watching.
Thank you, Marina. Thank you so much, Dr.
We'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.